Good morning, and welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Society of Albany. My name is Meredith Andrews, and I'm the Service Associate today. This morning, we welcome to our pulpit Dave Weissbard, my father, who was born into this congregation. He has been a minister for 56 years. He served congregations in Bedford, Massachusetts, Fairfax, Virginia, and Rockford, Illinois. He now preaches monthly in Central Square and Watertown, New York.
This is where we are.
Where do we go from here?
First, we must massively assert our dignity and worth.
We must stand up amidst a system that still oppresses and develop an assailable and majestic sense of values.
What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive.
And that love without power is sentimental and anemic.
Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice.
And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love.
And this is what we must see as we move on. And the first hymn is, I lost it. Gather the Spirit.
Please join the chalice lighting, words shown on the screen. Welcoming all free seekers of truth and meaning, we gather to excite the human spirit, to inspire its growth and development, to respond morally and ethically to a troubled world, and to sustain a vital and nurturing religious community. Next, we'll sing a unison song. The words will appear on the screen. Please join in singing With Joy We Claim the Growing Light.
This story, The Skin Again by Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks just died within the last 2 months or so. Just a wonderful story, and the illustrations, if it wouldn't violate copyright rules, I would have wanted to copy all the pages to show you, but you're not supposed to do that. The skin I'm in is just a covering. It cannot tell my story. The skin I'm in is just a covering. If you want to know who I am, you've got to come inside and open your heart way wide. The skin I'm in looks good on me, to me. It will let you know one small way to trace my identity. But then again, the skin I'm in will always be just a covering. It cannot tell my story. If you want to know who I am, you have got to come inside. Be with me inside the me of me, all made up of stories, present, past, and future. Some true to life and Others all fun and fantasy, all the way I imagine me. You can find all about me coming close and letting go of who you might think I am. Before you come inside and let me be real and you become real to me. All real then, in that place where skin again is one small way to see me, but not real enough to be all the me of me or the you of you, for we are all inside made up of real history, real dreams, and the stuff of all we hope for when we can be all real. Together on the inside.
Welcome to our viewers from Facebook who will be joining us now for our service. My name is Meredith Andrews, and I'm the service associate today. We welcome to our pulpit David Weissbard, who grew up in this church and has been a favorite guest minister for many decades.
Our reading is taken from R.G. Collingwood's book, The Idea of History. History is a Greek word meaning simply an investigation or inquiry. What history is, what it is about, how it proceeds, and what it is for are questions which to some extent different people would answer in different ways. But in spite of differences, there is a large measure of agreement between the answers. In a sense, we are all historians nowadays. All educated persons have gone through a process of education which has included a certain amount of historical thinking. Experience of historical thinking so gained is modeled on textbooks. And textbooks always describe not what is now being thought by real-life historians, but what was thought by real-life historians at some time in the past when the raw material was being created out of which the textbook has been put together. Connected with this, there is a peculiar illusion incidental to all knowledge that was acquired in the way of education, the illusion of finality. A student has to believe that things are settled because textbooks and his teachers or her teachers regard them as settled. Every historian would agree, I think, that history is a kind of research or inquiry. The four characteristics of history are A, that it is scientific or begins by asking questions, whereas the writer of legends begins by knowing something and tells what he knows. That it is humanistic or asks questions about things done by people at determinate times in the past. That it is rational and that it is self-revelatory. Here ends the reading of the morning. Let's take time now to share together some time for silent meditation. May it be so. Amen. Two weeks ago, we celebrated the 93rd anniversary of the birth of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Now we're on the eve of Black History Month. The two, of course, are intimately linked. Martin earned his PhD from Boston University, where his dissertation was a comparison of the conception of God in the thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wyman. Wyman was a Unitarian theologian, which is probably why Martin, while in Boston, went to the Unitarian Association's headquarters to explore becoming a Unitarian minister. Frederick May Elliott, who was the president of the association at the time, discouraged King, saying that as a black man, it was unlikely that he could land a Unitarian pulpit. That was sad for us, I think, but probably fortunate for the rest of the nation, because I doubt that Martin could have had the impact he did had he been identified as a Unitarian. In 1954, Martin became the minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, by which time he was already a national board member of the NAACP. Martin was subsequently arrested more than 20 times for leading nonviolent demonstrations for civil rights. In 1963, one of those incarcerations, he wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail. And then later that year, he led 250,000 people on the peaceful March on Washington, at which he delivered his I Have a Dream speech. Now that phrase was not in his manuscript, but the gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, who knew him and his repertoire well, called out to him mid-speech, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." He departed from his manuscript, and the rest is history. Later that year, Time magazine named him Man of the Year, and the next year he received the Nobel Peace Prize. In 1965, he was a major force behind the passage of the Bipartisan Voting Rights Act. You may remember that from history, not from contemporary reality. In 1967, King delivered an address at Riverside Church in New York City on Beyond Vietnam, a time to break silence. I commend that address to you. It is available on the internet. Among the important observations he shared that night was this: a true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and the justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will be only an initial act. One day, we must come to see that the whole Jericho Road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. Martin went on to say that a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense and on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Somehow this madness must cease, he said. We must stop now. I speak as a child of God and brother to the suffering poor of Vietnam. I speak for those whose land is being laid waste, whose homes are being destroyed, whose culture is being subverted. I speak for the poor of America who are paying the double price of smashed hopes at home and death and corruption in Vietnam. I speak as a citizen of the world, for the world as it stands aghast at the path we have taken. I speak as an American to the leaders of my own nation. The great initiative in this war is ours. The initiative to stop it must be ours. This address, seen by many as a significant contributor to the ending of the Vietnam War, marked the end of Dr. King's popularity. People were furious that he had strayed from what they saw as his mission, civil rights for people of color, a mission which was much narrower than his vision. It was a year later, to the day, while he was preparing for the Poor People's March on Washington and was in Memphis on behalf of striking garbage collectors, that King was assassinated. While Martin had been considered a popular, heroic figure for his leadership of the struggle for civil rights, Ibram X. Kendi asserts in a superb article in last October's Atlantic magazine that the second assassination of King began days after the first assassination. Almost a third of Americans polled in April 1968 felt that King himself was to blame for his assassination, felt that he had brought it on himself. When King was killed, he was one of the most hated people in America. Nearly half of Black Americans and 3/4 of white Americans disapproved of him when he stepped out onto that motel balcony. Death threats were a fact of his life. And Kendi went on to write, King's first assassins professed to hate him half a century ago, but his second assassins profess to revere him. King is adored in death, literally. King is still hated in life. When he reluctantly signed the bill creating the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, Ronald Reagan declared that the holiday was based on an image, not reality, which leads into the central theme of this sermon, myth and history. The Martin most people celebrate is a mythical figure, distinct from the real-life historical one. Ibram Kendi points out that historians and writers have called attention again and again and again to the misappropriation of King, the misunderstanding of King, the stealing of King, the attempts to defang King, the watering down of King, the whitewashing of King by the conservators of racial inequality. His modern-day assassins endlessly recite King's dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It's repeated by his modern-day assassins almost like a mantra, as if that was all King said during his 1963 March on Washington speech. They disregard the lines before it and after it, when King lamented that his dream was being thwarted by vicious racists in places sweltering with the heat of oppression. King told an NBC News correspondent in 1967 that the dream that I had in 1963 has at many points turned into a nightmare. Kendi says it was this nightmare of post-civil rights racial inequality that caused legal scholars in the 1970s to develop critical race theory in law schools, particularly to study and reveal the law's role in the maintenance of inequality. Kendi insists that it is wrong to present King, who continuously spoke out against racism, as someone who stood against people speaking out against racism. It is wrong to claim that teachers educating their students about past and present racism are stomping on the grave of Martin Luther King. But people such as Trump, McCarthy, and Mandel aren't simply stomping on King's grave themselves. These self-professed admirers of King are digging a new grave and burying King's body of work within it. Kendi concludes his article in The Atlantic, quoting the story of Joseph in the Hebrew Scriptures, Genesis 37:19-21. His brothers said to one another, "Behold, here comes the dreamer. Let us slay him, and we shall see what will become of his dream." Those engaged in applying critical race theory are working to advance the fulfillment of King's dream today, along with the thousands who are supporting the New Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, which was founded in 2018, the 50th anniversary of King's Poor People's Campaign, and which has an active chapter here in the Tri-Cities. I commend the Poor People's Campaign to you as a way of becoming involved in the struggle. I don't know about you, but I had never heard of critical race theory, commonly abbreviated as CRT, until almost 2 years ago, when the then occupant of the White House issued an executive order calling for the end of diversity training because of its basis in critical race theory. He said, "Critical race theory is a Marxist doctrine that rejects the vision of Martin Luther King Jr." Reportedly, the danger that theory represents to so much of what that office holder stood for was called to his attention by a right-wing filmmaker and evangelist, Christopher Rufo, who is a senior fellow at the conservative Manhattan Institute. If you watch Fox News, and even if you don't, CRT was mentioned more than 3,900 times in 2021, always negatively. Tucker Carlson calls it a cult. Miranda Devine says it's designed to warp the minds of American children. Newt Gingrich insists that CRT is intended to brainwash our kids. One of the most complete descriptions of what CRT is not but is charged with being can be found in Rufo's Critical Race Theory briefing book. In that, he asserts critical race theory is an academic discipline that holds that the United States is a nation founded on white supremacy and oppression, and that these forces are still at the root of our society. Critical race theorists believe that American institutions such as the Constitution and legal system preach freedom and equality, but are mere camouflages for naked racial domination. In simple terms, critical race theory reformulates the old Marxist dichotomy of oppressor and oppressed, replacing the class categories of bourgeoisie and proletariat with the identity categories of white and black. Now, there is a grain of truth in all that, but Rufo proceeds to go really off the deep end. He asserts CRT teaches that all whites are racist. Individuals categorized as white are inherently responsible for injustice and oppression committed by white populations in the past. That we must reject the principle of equality under the law, and that critical race theorists believe that society should work to abolish the white race. He insists that in schools, children are taught that they are defined by their race, not as individuals, and that they should hate each other and hate their country. Well, Rufo has tweeted, "We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think, aha, critical race theory. We've decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. Well, we might be tempted to file this stuff in a trash can full of crackpot ideas. The reality is that today, 21 Republican state legislatures have considered or are considering bills that would outlaw any teaching resembling CRT. Nothing should ever be taught, some say, that would make any child feel uncomfortable. School boards are being attacked by parents and by activists without kids who want no mention of the principles of CRT in classes. It's being proposed that teachers be required to wear body cameras so their teaching can be monitored. The governor of Texas, has set up a hotline for complaints by parents that the teachers are teaching the forbidden ideas. It's interesting that a number of liberals have decided to glom onto this hotline on the internet, and a lot of the stuff that's showing up there is actually against the anti-CRT people. Well, why should we take all of this stuff seriously? Because there is ground being fertilized by this horse manure. The progressive broadcaster Tom Hartman points to the millions who are convinced that there's an international conspiracy funded by Jews to replace European ancestry whites with people of color whose ancestors came from outside of Europe. They're frightened by the new census data showing that whites are a decreasing majority in America, and they're terrified by the prospect that Afghans who risked their lives for America might move here. Hartman goes on to assert, the source of their terror is their totally wrong and unscientific belief that skin color is a reliable indicator of intelligence, temperament, and trustworthiness. Therefore, they believe that skin color must always determine who has political, cultural, and economic power in America. Many are willing to take up arms and kill others to defend their right to live in an exclusively white-controlled region or country. They're in police departments, he says, across the country. They form heavily armed militia groups primed for a race war in America, and they occupy about 1 in every 3 residences in any random white neighborhood across the country. Well, I do hope that Hartman is off in his estimate of their prevalence, but there's no question that such races do exist and are a threat to the principles which our nation has been built on in theory. What actually is critical race theory and where did it come from? Let me be clear. I actually believe it's disingenuous for us to insist that CRT is not being taught in our schools. The formal discipline is not taught, but that isn't really what the conservatives are talking about. In practice, what CRT is fundamentally about is the belief that racism has been and is a significant element in the history of our nation, and that any history teaching that doesn't explore that relationship is a disservice to students. One of the terrible things about culture is that it has a tendency to blame the victim, and it's sadly effective at even convincing victims of their own responsibility for their conditions. A number of black scholars in the 70s and 80s began to ask, why was it, with the passage of such great civil rights legislation, that's had so little actual impact on the lives of black Americans? After all that legislation, blacks were still at the bottom of all measures of social well-being. Kimberly Crenshaw, professor of law both at Columbia and the University of California, asserts that King was, in fact, a critical race theorist before there was a name for it. Critical race theory, she says, explores how racial inequality was historically structured into the fabric of this republic, reinforced by law, insulated by the founding Constitution, and embedded into the infrastructure of American society. So critical race theory demands that we look in a different way at America's history, in a more critical way, a more thorough way, not just as we have in the past, from the white perspective. The New York Times 1619 Project was a significant shot across the bow of our conventional thinking about the role of race in American history. It shook some of the comforting false myths to which we in the white majority have clung. And as I said in the sermon, which first came out back at the time, which I delivered at the time that the project first came out, is I do not read that project as in any way being anti-white. What it does is fill in some significant gaps in our knowledge of American history. And the newly published book on the project, which I highly recommend to you, goes into more depth. I really encourage you to get it and to read it. There is no consensus as to whether the first Africans who were deposited on these shores in 1619, just 12 years after the settlement of Jamestown and a year before the Mayflower's arrival, were viewed as slaves or as indentured servants. But we do know that in 1662, Maryland enacted a law requiring all Negroes and other slaves to serve for the duration of their lives. A 1672 Virginia law was called an Act for the Apprehension and Suppression of Runaway Negroes and Slaves. That law gave immunity to any white person who killed or wounded a runaway person of color while pursuing them. This was the origin of the qualified immunity principle, which has hung up congressional approval these days of police reform. Our police forces can readily be traced back to the slave patrols. I was not aware of the clause in the rough draft of the Declaration of Independence that was ultimately deleted in the final version. Jefferson originally wrote, "King George has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation hither." Well, Jefferson later wrote that that clause about slavery was removed by the Continental Congress in complaisance to South Carolina and Georgia. Our northern brethren also, he said, I believe, felt a little tender under these censures, for though their people held very few slaves themselves, yet they had been pretty considerable carriers of them to others. New York City had one of the largest slave markets in America. Historian Clyde W. Ford points to Chief Justice Roger B. Taney's 1857 opinion for the majority in the Dred Scott case, in which he opined that blacks have no rights which the white man is bound to respect. Keep in mind that when Social Security was enacted, farm workers and domestic employees, occupations that encompassed significant numbers of black folk, were excluded at the insistence of Southern members of Congress. Also, the GI Bill of Rights, which helped so many veterans obtain homes after World War II, effectively excluded veterans of color through redlining and educational opportunities which were provided to white vets actually did not include many vets of color. Just this morning, I read on the internet that there is a new bill that has been proposed for the restoration of the rights for people of color or for their descendants to get the rights that had been given to other veterans. FEMA has only just changed its requirements for aid to people who've lost their homes in disasters. Black folks historically often passed property on to subsequent generations without any formal legal documentation, which meant that many black families were unable to prove ownership in a way that FEMA would then give them assistance. FEMA is now in the process of liberalizing the required documentation of ownership. Nationally, black farmers have lost more than 12 million acres of farmland over the past century, according to the Washington Post. And this is due to biased government policies and discriminatory business practices. In 1920, there were over 925,000 black farmers in the United States, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. But by 1997, their numbers had fallen to just under 18,500. 925,000 down to 18,500. Policies of the USDA have been a major contributor to that decline. Hasn't just happened because the farmers were lazy. Recent data reveals that the USDA continues to disproportionately reject the requests of black farmers for loans. According to CNN, 42% of black farmers were rejected for direct USDA loans in 2021, while only 9% of white farmers were rejected. And this is for crop loans to carry them on until the crops can be harvested. Last March, Congress passed a sweeping debt relief program that provides $5 billion worth of debt relief for socially disadvantaged farmers of color. Texas Agriculture Commissioner Sid Miller has gone to court to block implementation of that law, saying it would lead only to disunity and discord. These legal sources of discrimination have meant that black families have been denied access to many of the means of acquiring wealth, not mentioning the educational deprivation that has followed from separate and not equal segregated schools. And do keep in mind, please, that statistics show that today a black child is no more likely to be in an integrated classroom than they were prior to the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown v. Board of Education. This is what is meant by systemic racism. But conservatives would rather blame the victims. Were you taught in school about the massacre in Greenwood, Missouri in 1921? Or Rosewood, Florida? Both successful black communities that were considered a threat by whites. Or Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. Opelousas, Louisiana in 1868. Atlanta, 1906. Elaine, Arkansas, 1919. Ocoee, Florida, 1920. Today, though, we're much more civilized. Mob lynchings have been largely replaced by the mass incarceration of blacks by men and women in black judicial robes who achieve effectively the same result by pretending to act under the color of law. These racial realities have not generally been a part of our American history curricula. One of the most fascinating articles I encountered in my research for the sermon was one that I found on the History News Network, reprinted from The Root, which is a black periodical that brings together writings by black scholars. Researchers looked into the history education of many of the leading Republican opponents of critical race theory. The article notes that when Mitch McConnell and 38 Republican senators sent a letter to the Secretary of Education decrying the ghastly prospect of white students having to learn actual facts about slavery, it was not unexpected. For centuries, this country's schools have perpetuated a whitewashed version of history that either erases or reduces the story of Black America down to a B plot in the American script. It's why they hate critical race theory, the 1619 Project, and anything factual, because the white-centric interpretation of our national past is so commonly accepted. White people have convinced themselves that anything that varies from the Caucasian myths must be a lie. As I said, what scholars did was they investigated what history texts various Republican leaders were exposed to as high school students. After moving to Louisville, Kentucky and attending DuPont Manual High School, Mitch McConnell, who just differentiated this month between Black Americans and Americans would have been taught history in an education department which still is teaching this to this day about slavery in Kentucky. Because many owners and servants worked side by side or had frequent contact, the bond between them was more patriarchal than was the relationship shared by slaves and masters in other states. While exceptions can be noted, it is generally believed that Kentucky's slaves experienced a less harsh life than those living elsewhere. Tom Cotton, Republican of Arkansas, insists that the 1619 Project is left-wing propaganda. It's revisionist history at its worst. His high school history text was The American Pageant, in which the war for Southern independence is depicted as being just about tariffs. The book does not quote any of the declarations of secession, which make it explicit that slavery was the central issue in the war. That book notes only that the rebel Jefferson Davis told that despotic King Abraham Lincoln, "All we ask is to be let alone." Lindsey Graham School in Pickens County, South Carolina, didn't desegregate until 1970, which was 15 years after the Brown v. Board decision was announced. The history text from which Graham was taught in the 1958 edition of the History of South Carolina declared that most masters treated their slaves kindly. Africans were brought from a worse life to a better one. As slaves, they were trained in the ways of civilization. Above all, the landowners argued the slaves were given the opportunity to become Christians in a Christian land instead of remaining in a savage country. The text praised the Klan for keeping justice alive during Reconstruction. The sight of the mounted Klansmen in their white robes was enough to terrorize the Negroes. That textbook names only one Black person in the entire book. That was Denmark Vesey, who was executed for starting a slave revolt. There are several more examples, but you get the point. If you and I had gone through those schools and learned history the way it was taught in the South, and even frankly in a good part of the North, it would not be surprising that we would be offended by what so many are calling revisionist history, as if that's a bad thing. I distinctly remember that I was taught by Miss Lulu Charles, just up the road here, in my American history class at Albany High School, that Reconstruction was a disaster because the former slaves were simply unprepared for voting and were exploited by carpetbaggers and scalawags. The History.com website reports that during and immediately after the Civil War, many Northerners headed to the southern states driven by hopes of economic gain, a desire to work on behalf of the newly emancipated slaves, or a combination of both. These carpetbaggers, whom many in the South viewed as opportunists looking to exploit and profit from the region's misfortunes, supported the Republican Party and would play a central role in shaping new Southern governments during Reconstruction. That site goes on to say that in the 2 years following the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln and the end of the Civil War in April 1868, Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, angered many Northerners and Republican members of Congress with his conciliatory policies toward the defeated South. In the congressional elections of 1866, Northern voters rejected Johnson's view of Reconstruction. Henry Louis Gates, in an opinion column in the New York Times, pointed out that during Reconstruction, 80% of the Black men eligible to vote in 10 of the 11 former Confederate states registered to vote, and soon they were sending delegates to new state constitutional conventions on the basis of equal citizenship. Overall, more than 2,000 Black office holders would be elected during Reconstruction throughout the South, including by 1901 a total of 20 Black congressmen and 2 United States senators, both from Mississippi. So determined were most white Southerners to maintain their own way of life that they resorted to fraud, intimidation, and murder in order to reestablish their own control of the state governments. The historian Rayford W. Logan wrote in his classic work, The Betrayal of the Negro, in essence, he said, the new civil war within the Southern states stemmed from an adamant determination to restore white supremacy. Well, that's not what I was taught about Reconstruction. How about you? The laws that are being enacted now to protect students from revisionist history have teachers and administrators and school boards concerned, wondering whether it would be safe to even mention the words race or slave or segregation in history classes. Kimberly Crenshaw, a law professor at Columbia and UCLA Law School, and one of the major CRT advocates, in an ACLU blog interview, talked about how hard it would be to address the problem of asbestos in our schools if we were not allowed to ever use the word asbestos. She points out it's equally impossible to envision doing anything to reduce the continuing impact of racism in this country if we cannot use the word race and have to live in fear of any kids feeling badly about honest portions of our history. I really have trouble getting my arms around how ignorant I have been about the actual victory in the Civil War. While we in the North are taught that the Union won, in the South it's much less clear. When we look at the actual history following Reconstruction, a good case can be made for the Old South having risen again without much interference from the federal government. Sharecropping is not the same as slavery, heaven knows, but when you come right down to the living of it, maybe the plantation owner now has less responsibility for their workers than he or she had before. The Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act has resulted in the passage and pending passage of scores of laws clearly designed to restrict black voting, Jim Crow too. All of this opens up the question of what is history? Is history that which is contained in the pages of a history textbook? Decisions always play a major role in what is included in those texts. And what do you do when historians learn more about what actually transpired? Frank Fioretti, in his book Mythical Past, Elusive Future, points out that for a long time, history has been a fragmented discipline. There is no history with a capital H. There are many competing histories. A lack of agreement about history reflects the lack of consensus today, and vice versa. Particularly disturbing, he says, for the guardians of establishment values is the realization that they can no longer assume that their version of the past will not be contested. How reliable a picture of what happened in the past do our histories present? When George Floyd was killed, the initial police report said he was ordered to step from his car. After he got out, he physically resisted officers. Officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs and noted that he appeared to be suffering medical distress. Officers called for an ambulance, and he was transported to Hennepin County Medical Center by ambulance, where he died a short time later. Well, what if that account was the basis for future histories? It was only because of Darnell or Frazier's videotaping that the truth eventually came to light. But even with that evidence, there are still many who believe that Derek Chauvin should not have been convicted of George Floyd's murder. If you look at the various articles on the January 6th insurrection, you get radically different pictures of what happened, even though we've got tons of videotape giving a pretty clear message. But what will history say? I mean, what do we really know for sure about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, of John Kennedy, of Martin Luther King? Up close and farther away, we have a problem knowing for sure what really happened, what we saw, what is reported, what is recorded. One of the best teachers that I had at Albany High School was my world history teacher, Elsa Troidel. Mrs. Troidel handed out the textbooks at the beginning of the year, and she said, here, take these, put them in your lockers so you can give them back to me at the end of the school year undamaged. The challenge that we faced was to go to the library daily and to research the variety of explanations and descriptions of historical events. And we discovered that there was a variety. We learned that real history is not something that is confined to the pages of a textbook. I've always blanched at the phrase revisionist history. Would we want our physics not to be revised as we learn more? Would we want psychology not to be revised as we learn more about human nature? Our understanding of the past is dependent upon available information, and additions to that information require the revision of the history. That's what critical race theory is about, trying to get to the root of what actually happened in our nation's history and the impact that history has had on our nation even today. CRT is about truth. It is about justice. It is about how real people were impacted by events. And those are the last things that people who are committed to the status quo want us to address. Critical race theory is not about blaming contemporary individuals for the way things have been, white or black. Again, it's about the search for truth, painful though that may be. Leon Litwack, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, has pointed out, few people have cared more deeply about this nation than some of its severest critics, we need to be wary of those who, in the name of protecting our freedoms, would diminish them. History teaches, after all, that it is not the rebels, the iconoclasts, the curious, the dissidents who endanger a democratic society, but rather the accepting, the unthinking, the unquestioning, the docile, the obedient, the silent, and the indifferent. Kimberly Crenshaw reminds us that King implored that we put our bodies on the line to face the organized forces of white reaction in his day. And it's clear that he'd be fighting in exactly the same way to preserve his prophetic legacy in our own day, when the right to equal education, to vote freely, and to realize true cross-racial justice are once more under bitter attack. Reclaiming King's legacy is to realize that there is no daylight between a truly democratic society and a racially just one. What will become of Martin Luther King's dream? That's in our hands. May it be so.
An important way we celebrate each Sunday is by offering an opportunity to practice generosity. Members and friends support our congregation with an annual pledge paid throughout the year. Another way to support the good work of this congregation is by making a generous contribution via one of the options shown on this next slide. You can click on the tiny URL link in the chat window to contribute, or you can send a text to the number shown on the screen. The examples on the slide show how to label your text to indicate the amount and the purpose or intent of your gift. We must now say goodbye to our Facebook friends. Consider joining us on Zoom next time. You can find more information at albanyuu.org. We enjoy welcoming guests and visitors to our service. If you'd like to tell us who you are or where you're from, you can click on the raise hand symbol. Depending on your Zoom version, you will find the raise hand option either in the participant window or in the reactions button on your Zoom toolbar. Our technician will invite you to unmute and introduce yourself. You may also, or instead, click on the visitor link you'll find now in the chat window.
We don't have any raised hands at this time.
Thank you and welcome to all who have joined us today. If you'd like to learn more about our congregation or Unitarian Universalism, you can find it in the participant window, someone with welcome before their name. You can reach out to that person privately in the chat window now or after the service. We welcome the chance to greet each other. In our Zoom format, this is done through virtual breakout rooms. You can say hello and share your name. This will last about 2 minutes, and then we'll all come back together. As I select a stone on behalf of those joys and sorrows that are left unspoken, let us hold all that we've heard and felt in our hearts.
Our hymn is Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Black National Anthem.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community,
Or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Now may the truths that make us free, the hope that never dies, and the love that casts out fear lead us and those we love, and those whom nobody loves, forward together till the dayspring breaks and the shadows flee away. Amen.
Our thanks to musicians Al DeSalvo and Karen Wells, ushers Kristen Abbas, Annika Pfluger, Pastoral Care Associates Chuck Manning, Eric Van Housen, Service Associate myself, our welcomer Barb Manning, Office Support Tammy Goddard Hathaway, Patience Pichette, Technical Support Kate Pierce, Dick Dana. Flowers, as we heard wonderfully, were arranged by Cindy Herrick. Flowers were donated today by Carol Butt in memory of Mark Butt, who contributed much of his time and talent to Albany UU over about 40 years. Our announcements today join Reverend Sam and Elizabeth Baldus and the Ministry Operations team in welcoming our new Religious Education Council Chairperson, Michael Hornsby, today at 12 noon. Stay right here on this service link to join. The Albany UU COVID response team recently determined that the option to attend Sunday morning services in person and in-person religious education groups will resume on Sunday, February 27th. Yay, yay, yay. The option to attend service on Zoom will remain. The health and safety of the church community continues to be our top priority, and we thank everyone for their understanding and flexibility as we continue to monitor and navigate this complicated situation. Congregational conversations on the 8th principle of Unitarian Universalism, Tuesday, February 1st at 7 p.m. and Sunday, February 6th at 12 p.m. As we move forward towards a congregational vote, the 8th principle sub-team of the inclusivity team would like to invite you to participate in a congregational conversation surrounding the adoption of the 8th principle. Please join one of the virtual Zoom conversations and let your voice be heard.